Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bosnian Advocacy Center's panel discussion, 25 years since Dayton, the road ahead. Bosnian Advocacy Center is an independent NGO that advocates for a free, sovereign, democratic, and secular Bosnia and Herzegovina. We promote Bosnian causes and interests in international media, foreign governments, and international organizations. Today, we are going to discuss the November 1995 events in Dayton, changing international circumstances over the last couple of decades, and opportunities and challenges of the road ahead for Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is my honor to present you today's speakers. Our first speaker is Muhamed Sacirbey. He's a former ambassador to the United Nations and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was also a member of the Bosnian delegation in Dayton negotiations. Our second speaker is Reuf Bajrović. He is a Bosnian American activist, politician, and policy analyst who presently co-chairs the US-Europe Alliance in Washington, D.C. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Sacirbey. You were a member of the Bosnian delegation in Dayton. You obviously understand the context of the negotiations. Are there any interesting but not well-known details prior to negotiations? And how do you look at the process of finalizing the peace agreement in November 1995 from today's perspective?
Thank you for inviting me, and I wish you and Reuf all the best in your efforts on behalf of Bosnia and also, frankly, the United States and what we view as the liberal democracies. Because to start out with, and just to provide a background from my perspective on this, 25 years ago, we thought we were putting an end to a conflict that was based in the 20th century. The First World War started with an assassination in Sarajevo, and it seemed like the last war of the 20th century would end with Bosnia. But actually, it seems very much now that the war of Bosnia and Herzegovina was really the first war of the 21st century, the first conflict. And that very much continues. And the relevance of that is we're not looking at history, we're looking at the future. But today you asked me about a bit about history. And when people ask me about Dayton, they frequently ask me what happened in Dayton. And I think you phrased it the correct way, which is what happened really before Dayton. What could have been done, should have been done, was done, but somehow then erased away in Dayton. Let's make sure this is understood. An end to the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina was absolutely necessary. War is a great injustice. So it's not just a strategic concept. War is much more than that. It destroys lives, particularly innocent lives, and it destroys them through murder, through killings, but also through denying people education and a sense of normalcy. Many who fight and fight bravely end up obviously suffering the consequences for the rest of their life as well. So when we speak of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was absolutely necessary to end, but it actually ended several months before we came to Dayton. This was in part due to several very important roles that we undertook in terms of our diplomacy, and particularly the role that I played as foreign minister, but also because the Bosnian army would not be defeated and because the Bosnian citizens would not quit resisting. And this was important because when I started my action on behalf of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the UN in 1992, it became very clear to me for a while that while people spoke very nicely of the Bosnian cause and were very sympathetic to the suffering, they all expected Bosnia to lose. And in fact, they were waiting for Bosnia to lose. And then when we didn't lose and when we didn't disappear, we became a very inconvenient reminder of the betrayal of the human rights and the strategic interest that many of these countries had in seeing what I would call a new world order, something that would do away with the old authoritarian, communist, fascist regimes that presumably were about to be erased away. And when we wouldn't succumb, then at least in one moment, we had to be taken seriously, both on the negotiating level and on the military level. Now, without the military level, we would not have been taken seriously. And in fact, without the military, the Bosnian military, we would not have had NATO intervention. Let me speak a little bit just of the military element here, which is that Bosnia and Herzegovina had the capacity to defend itself, but did not have the capacity to engage in offensive actions to liberate its territory. And that's where NATO action was very important. And without getting into the detail and sounding like someone who's promoting my own role, we played a term that I like to use frequently, diplomatic poker, and managed to get NATO action, not only against Mladic's forces, but most importantly, to lift the siege of Sarajevo. So by the time we reached Dayton, the siege of Sarajevo was lifted. Now, we didn't have normalcy. We didn't have anything that looked like a lasting peace, but we had an end more or less to the killings, certainly to the shellings, indiscriminate shellings. And why is that important? Because our major goal was met, which was to end the fighting. The second major goal that we had, and presumably would achieve through Dayton, was to establish a Bosnia and Herzegovina that would function and that would fulfill its Euro-Atlantic intentions. That is, that would fulfill the democratic, institutional, constitutional prerequisites to entering the European Union and NATO. Now, before Dayton, we had 2 or 3 months of proximity talks where I was the primary Bosnian interlocutor, mostly dealing with Richard Holbrooke, but with others. And we had a working group on a constitution for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we also had working with our American friends, including those in Holbrooke's team, providing the initial outline of what the Constitution would look like. So when we finally went into Dayton, things looked much different than when we came out of Dayton. And needless to say, I resigned during Dayton because what happened in Dayton was very disappointing to me as a Bosnian foreign minister, but also in terms of my American values. In part, let me try to summarize it because it's a very long process. In part, it wasn't about whether the military campaign would continue in Bihać or to take over Banja Luka. The real issue is what kind of conditions would the ultra-nationalist Serbians, as well as Milosevic, have to meet? And I talk about the ultra-nationalist Serbians, and that would also apply, of course, to all ultra-nationalists in Bosnia. What kind of conditions would they have to meet in order to participate in a government that has a Euro-Atlantic perspective, a democratic perspective? Now, everyone somehow promoted the idea of some notion of tolerance. And I've come over time to realize that it's really the commitment to tolerance is an empty gesture where you're just basically saying we're okay with the country being divided and we will tolerate the others who are in our region. Bosnia, as well as the United States, their strength is in diversity. And that's certainly much more than just respecting the other and not killing them. So what we have done away with this so-called diplomatic process is really throw away diversity that made Bosnia such a power, even though it's a small country, that made the United States a power. In short, as we participate in your conversation, I just want to summarize in this way. We went to Dayton too early because we didn't have the prerequisites for a true constitutional arrangement, a peace agreement. And we walked away from Dayton signing something that in effect has been interpreted now in giving those very people who sought to divide and undermine and destroy the country, who in effect have given them a veto over the future of the country. But now that veto is no longer a veto in Banja Luka or Belgrade, or for that matter, Zagreb. That veto now is in the Kremlin and in China. And these are the countries that are exploiting this lack of direction that Bosnia and Herzegovina has for their own purposes. They're making Bosnia what I would call a geopolitical ball, and where the Bosnians are not the players, but they are the ball. They're being kicked around. And this idea that somehow the Bosnians are going to again reestablish the rules to this game and they're going to become the players in their own game, that's not just wishful thinking. That is a way to fool the Bosnians that they are somehow responsible for their own current situation. No, Dayton, it was prematurely rushed, is responsible for their current situation. Dayton did have an outcome that would solve everything, which is that the future of Bosnia would slowly evolve into a Euro-Atlantic framework. We don't need to talk about Dayton 2 as long as we know that Bosnia and Herzegovina belongs to the institutions of the Euro-Atlantic family, because those institutions will in effect send the guidelines, the bounds by which the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina could be further negotiated and determined. Without those bounds, then anything is open, including a deterioration in the current situation of Bosnia. So what Bosnia and Herzegovina needs to say is, Dayton promised a Euro-Atlantic future. We are not there yet. It is way delayed. Dayton was a compromise, not just with Milosevic and his agents, but in fact, it was something that was demanded by the US, particularly Holbrooke and the Europeans. Holbrooke, I mention him because he wanted to show Bosnia and Herzegovina so-called peace deal as his signature, as his ultimate achievement, which would get him the Nobel Peace Prize, but most importantly, from his perspective, get him to be the Secretary of State in the 1996. He thought that since Bob Dole and company had a more aggressive vision in dealing with the Serbian forces, that somehow showing that Dayton worked and there was a signature and the Bosnians had accepted it, that this would somehow make him more worthy in Bill Clinton's eyes, and that Bill Clinton would in effect award him with the Secretary of State role. So in effect, the timing of the Dayton Peace Agreement did not fit the needs of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It fit the needs of outside players like Holbrooke, but it happened then to coincide with those of Milosevic, who said, wow, I don't really have to do too much. We don't have to prove ourselves in any way, is committed to not only Bosnia and Herzegovina's future as part of the Euro-Atlantic family, but Milosevic can stay on and lead Serbia in the ultimate direction that he led it to, which was in the end very destructive to Serbia itself.
So did Bosnia even have a
ahead.
chance to delay the negotiations?
That was my position. I thought President Izetbegović's position was significantly different. And I don't want to say it was not justified. He was concerned about a return to normalcy, because it was not only about ending the war, but he viewed that the longer the status quo of, in effect, a country that was still trying to recover from war continued, the more people would emigrate and the more difficult it would be for refugees that were forced out of ethnically cleansed areas, particularly in the RS, for them to return. So the idea is, the quicker you can get those refugees back, the more likely that Bosnia would return to something that it was before the war. I consciously understood this dilemma. And my view was that it was as or more important to destroy the virus that had infected Bosnia and the region. In fact, there was a term that we used, you're very young, so you may not remember that term, but it's a term that came from another great conflict, and it was called denazification. And that's still an appropriate term. And as we see what's happened in other areas of the world, including the United States, we have a tendency toward Nazification. And in part, the start of this, and that's why I call the Bosnia and Herzegovina the start of a new round of conflict. This was again the legitimization of Nazification, of fascism, because the idea of saying America first, somehow that was supposed to sound patriotic and we're supposed to ignore all the other elements of it. But before America first, there was, Greater Serbia and the Three Fingers, and what it came down to is the great generation that had defeated the Nazis in Imperial Japan was dying out. And their memory of what they had fought against was becoming forgotten. And in fact, as is inevitably the case, there's a very large segment of our human population in any country that is prepared to accept anything that sounds patriotic and religious. In other words, if someone says, I'm for country and God, they're afraid to say, you're a fake. And right now, in the Western world and in the Islamic world, not to mention some long established autocracies, the best way for people to gain power, the most efficient way, I should say, is for them to say that they're acting on behalf of country and God.
Right. Mr. Bajrović, considering the efforts of the international community, especially the United States at the beginning of the 20th century in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also their declining role since 2006, could you provide your insight on the role of the international community in Bosnia over the last 25 years, those ups and downs, positives and negatives?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank Ambassador Minister Sacirbey for his service. It is my honor to share the stage with him in any way. And I was old enough to remember what he did. And, younger folks like you, Ismail, don't actually remember what an excellent job he did. And that's just a fact. And I feel like that fact is not repeated often enough. And Ambassador Sacirbey, thank you very much again. I was 17, 18 at the time, and I was in the US. And I will never forget, the way you represented us on CNN at the UN. It was just, that was probably your role, your mission in life. And, you did it impeccably, in my view.
Thank you.
I mean it. I really think so. Your question, Ismail, is a very good one. And I will piggyback on what Ambassador Sacirbey said. Completely agreeing with what he said, actually. And I'll add something else to the equation that he actually, I don't even remember we spoke about this during the war as Bosnians. Some others did on our behalf, like Joe Biden, actually. He would say that the reason that the West abandoned us, and as Ambassador Sacirbey eloquently said, was awaiting our demise while pretending to be siding with us passively, was because we're Muslim. And I mean, we have a very deep tension within our culture, I think, that we ourselves have not dealt with yet. I mean, I include myself in that as well. We don't really belong anywhere. I mean, I think the only people that can really relate to us on this particular level are the Jews, because we're Muslims, yet we're European. And so we're both and neither at the same time. And we did not really have a strong backer in the 90s. That's something most people forget. And Ambassador Sacirbey remembers how we depended so much on the goodwill of the US, which was mostly there. I mean, let's face it, the Americans were never really against us. I mean, there were parts of the US government that did not consider helping us a priority. And years later, even during my time in Washington, I met many of the participants from the US side who would often say that the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies frequently provided the White House with the assessment which basically said that we had, a month, 2, 5, 6, 7, it was just a question of time before Sarajevo would fall. That was the sort of consensus in Washington, all the way up until I think 1994, when they realized we're actually not going to back down. We're not going to disappear into the, as my friend Sulik says, we're not going to move from physical world to books. We just, we're going to continue living where we are. And I think that element of our identity that we did not choose, it was chosen by our forefathers many hundreds of years ago, still determines the way that the West oftentimes sees us. I don't think the US sees us that way. I think US is an honest broker still, on many levels. As Ambassador said, I think we share the values of diverse societies, and we see diversity as a strength. But since the end of the war, I think that there are 3 distinct phases of the implementation of Dayton. And I myself participated in the arena during the 3rd phase, the worst phase, which we're in still. So the first phase, I'd say, is 95 to about 99, 2000. When it was times of just simple reconstruction, let's keep the peace. Carl Bildt was there, who, as we would later learn, was never really an honest broker. He was always very partial and biased. And then you had Westendorp, the guy who ran OHR, sort of okayish. And then when Petric came, things turned around. So Petric-Patty times is I would consider a 2nd phase, where the international community, and I think one of the things that over time we actually learned to appreciate is how much the British government, especially Tony Blair, actually played a positive role in helping build the Bosnian state via the OHR and the international mechanisms that are available to the international community via Dayton. And then I think the reason that they were helping build the Bosnian state was sort of an atonement. They were trying to atone for the sins that we all know about. That basically they just disarmed us, prevented us from getting defending ourselves. We actually do not have a right to self-defense, which is another thing that I think everybody is conveniently forgotten. And they tried to atone for that. They were waiting up. The Europeans were actually waiting for us to disappear. Clinton, even in his famous book, the book called Clinton Tapes, there's a quote by Bill Clinton, which, I think it was Mitterrand who said that this is an ugly but natural restoration of Christian Europe. So that didn't work out, thankfully for us. We managed to survive. But I think the Iraq War really changed the West irreversibly in many ways. I think Merkel winning in 2005 and the sort of end of the American dominance after it was apparent that Iraq was not going to go, become a democracy overnight the way people expected, we entered the 3rd phase, which coincides with the rise to power of Milorad Dodik. And it was we basically lost the last 15 years. So Bosnia has lost 15 years, during which Serbia's overtaken Bosnia as the leader of the European integration process. Croatia has joined the EU and NATO. Albania has joined NATO. Montenegro has joined NATO. Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Romania. So basically, everybody's overtaken Bosnia. And my experience, after having spent a few years, actually participating in some of these meetings, I think that for one to understand really how things work, one needs to spend at least a few minutes or a few days in what I call a command vehicle. In America, they call it the sausage making, right? So once the doors are closed, and once people start negotiating, you actually see everybody's bottom line. So the moment when my sort of eye opener was 2011. I was part of the SDP, but junior source. I was part of the negotiating team for the government formation, where HDZ was trying to block government formation. And my father's colleague, Božo Ljubić, who's a surgeon, worked with my father for years. I've known Božo for many years, openly told us during one of these meetings that as far as they're concerned, so the HDZ, he was not HDZ 99 at the time, we are all simply Muslim. There's no left, right, center. they don't care. It's not, you will never get out of the position that you're put in, because that's how it works. And what came as a shock to me was that the German government actively supported that position, not openly, of course, it was never open, but I remember Christoph Heusgen calling my boss at a time and screaming at him because the Americans had basically, told to the Croats, to the HDZ, just, either give it up or let these people form government, and the Germans were really mad. So I realized countries change opinions, countries change views, interests, and so on. None of this is all of this can change. But what I figured at that point in time is that Bosnia's position is determined by the international circumstance. That's the unfortunate conclusion I came to. And I think Ambassador Sacirbey is absolutely right. I think the sense of agency that people have is oftentimes a coping mechanism, because this situation is more or less a result of international circumstances that don't have much to do with Bosnia. So in broad strokes, the Germans have basically come to an understanding with the Russians since Merkel came to power. And I think the implicit conclusion is that Bosnia and some of these other countries are not going to be joining EU or NATO, which the Russians don't want. And the Germans are going to turn a blind eye to what Dodik is doing, and of course are going to continue supporting Čović because he's a member of HDZ, which is, a sister party of CDU. The Americans were actually uninterested since the fall of the April package. I've also evolved on my views regarding the April package. We can talk about that later as an attempt to amend it. But, the Brits were trying to do something, but, middling power really cannot do as much as Americans can if they want to. So we're in this stagnation that's been going on for 15 years. And the main driver of change in Bosnia has been this disillusionment with the role of government in people's lives. And I think that the reason that Dayton's basically failed as a governing setup, as a governing mechanism, is because no country in the world can have any sort of progress with this type of system that Bosnia has. Over the years, I've actually realized that the consociational setup that was enforced here is actually meant to produce results that we've lived for the last 15 years. That's the whole point. So the point of Dayton is to create a permanent situation which is basically hopeless. So there are ways to get out of this. I mean, I don't feel hopeless. I think that there's some hope for Bosnia in terms of how the constitution will look like in the future. I think there's, some things are on the horizon, I think. But Bosnians need to understand that working with foreign powers, especially Americans, the Brits and the Germans, is an absolute necessity if they want to keep their state alive.
So you were talking about the role of the international community. What mistakes were made by the pro-Bosnian politicians over the last decades that potentially cost us a more efficient and better functioning state?
I think that that's a very difficult question, because I know all these people like Ambassador Sacirbey does, and it's really hard to be very frank. I mean, so I'm not going to be entirely frank. So, I'll try to sort of be diplomatic. I used to think that the April package, what Silajdžić did was a disaster and a catastrophe. But I think that he's been redeemed somewhat in the last 14, 15 years. Because, I'm also probably saying this for the first time publicly, his objection to the way the Council of Ministers was supposed to be formed was valid. So the fact that if the government wasn't, there were, I think, 2 rounds of 2 attempts at forming government after the election. If both fail, you would have a vacuum, which is not the case now because the members of the presidency are directly elected. So I think he was right there. But in terms of the international political dynamic, it was a blow, because the Americans really disengaged to an extent after that, and I think they're more or less in the same mode in that sense. There's another underappreciated moment that most people don't talk about, which is that after the government formation, the federation, where Ahad Eze was kicked out of government, which is which big plus in my view. The SDP really shot itself in the foot and really did damage to the relationship with the US, because the Americans really backed the SDP considerably. The Obama people very, very helpful, and they were trying to do things right, inject some American capital, try to connect Bosnia with the US as much as possible, which due to just petty politics within Bosnia, SDA SDP relations just blew up. And US, it's been really 8 years since the US engaged seriously because of that. And Germans were really, getting on the Americans. I don't want to say what, but they were sort of, I told you so, in the I told you so mode. So I think those are two important points in the last 15 years or maybe 20 years. And I think one underestimated debacle, really, and we don't want to talk about it because I know the people that were involved, is the implementation of the decision of the Constitutional Court in 2002, the so-called Sarajevska Deklaracija, the Sarajevo Declaration, which introduced asymmetric constitutional arrangement in the federation, the DRS. That was, I don't think, that was just bad negotiation. It was not very wise.
Thank you, Mr. Bajrovic. Ambassador Sacirbey, can you compare and contrast the political spirit of the 1990s, given the immediate post-Cold War era, and that of today, where entirely different issues such as the politics of identity dominate the political agenda? And what implications can we expect on Biden's approach to Bosnia?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the answer is, I actually think you can compare. What's happened is the so-called New World Order that we expected to come after the demise of the Soviet Union and a new, presumably, movement toward free and democratic states, that hasn't happened. Instead, what we have seen is a reversion really to authoritarian governments, authoritarian leaders, and a reversion to fascism. And as a consequence, that's why I said Bosnia, the conflict in Bosnia, was not the last war of the 20th century. It was actually the first war of the 21st. Because Reuf rightfully speaks of the lost 25 years for Bosnia. It's actually been a lost 25 years for the free world. And let me use a little bit of an analogy here. Bosnia is like the patient that goes to see the doctor where everything is hurting. And when it goes to see a heart doctor, the problem's with the heart. When it goes to see an orthopedic doctor, you have a broken leg. When it goes to see a neurologist, well, you have a problem with migraines or some other tumor in your brain. So the idea that somehow Bosnia can be healed from within is not a realistic expectation. How about if that patient that went to see all those doctors said, I'm a dentist, and all of these doctors had a tooth problem. And all of these doctors then would act with much greater integrity if that dentist could, in fact, resolve their problems with their tooth. And Bosnia, in fact, is that ache that everyone refuses to recognize, or let's put it this way, everyone wants to recognize in a way that solves their own narrative, plays into their own narrative. So we had President Macron of Paris refer to Bosnia as a source of Muslim jihadists or extremists in several references. But in fact, we know that it's been also a source for ultra-right and Christian extremists. The people that committed the murders, not just in New Zealand in a mosque, but the people who killed 77 young people in Norway were inspired by Mladic and Karadzic and the narrative they derived from Bosnia. The extremists within France itself, Marie Le Pen's, they derive their inspiration from the Christian right extremists within Bosnia. That's the same, really, even with many people who are around Donald Trump. So this idea that somehow Bosnia can be dealt with as a patient that's taken into a hospital, and as any patient has to come to terms with its own limitations, that it somehow is almost like an invalid and has to be put in a wheelchair to be wheeled around. No, Bosnia can actually get on its feet, and it managed to do very well on its feet before 1995. Actually, unfortunately, what's happened is, in many ways, the Dayton Agreement has been interpreted as to put Bosnia first on crutches and then into a wheelchair. And the question is, how's Bosnia going to get out of it? Well, the only way it's going to get out of it is someone sees Bosnia as worthy of getting out of that wheelchair in terms of their own interests. And Bosnia has several very unique benefits as an ally. One of them is that in dealing with the extremists in any ranks, from the Muslim to the Orthodox, if you understand Bosnia, you know how to deal with that, you will in fact know how to deal with those extremists in the other areas. If you talk about what's the place of Islam in Europe, you're not going to deport Algerian French or Turkish German. There's millions of them. If they want to look at a European Muslim society that has, in fact, very strong European roots. And Reuf, I think here, maybe you're saying a little bit, emphasizing too much how we don't belong. We actually do belong. We belong like any other nation. If you look at the history of the Euro-Asian continent, you will see that there's everything from the Alans to the Kazans to the Huns to the Magyars to the Germans, the Slavic. They're all moving around. And many of them were not Christian. Some of them actually, the Kazans had a very large Jewish history. There was a very strong Muslim history in Europe. And probably the furthest civilization west for a millennium almost was not a Christian civilization. It was actually the Moorish Muslim civilization. So this idea that somehow, and I think President Izetbegović, although I very much respect his intentions and even his perspective on this, Muslims of Bosnia is going to not between East and West. We, by many of our own characteristics, belong to the West. We have strong links to the East, but Christianity has its own links to the East. That's where its origins are, as are ours. So what it brings me to is the real crucial question of what now? What now? And my dealings with Senator Biden have led me to one very straightforward conclusion. Let's not talk about being a friend of Bosnia, or for that matter, an enemy of anyone else. The one mistake that the Clinton people and subsequent administrations made is that they somehow thought that Russia under the current Putin leadership or China under the current leadership could be redeemed, could somehow be drawn into the West. They cannot be. And we have no reason to want to involve them in our situation. But we do have a reason that to tell the West, you need us, because not only can we deal with all of these factors that are troubling your own societies and your own countries, but beyond your own borders. We, in fact, through Bosnia, have the new Berlin Wall. And we know how much emphasis was placed by the United States and the so-called Free Europe in dealing with the Berlin Wall. It was not seen just as a Berlin or even German issue. It was seen very much as a Euro-Atlantic issue. So we must project that we are part of the Euro-Atlantic family and no longer go to these meetings that Reuf has spoken about and say, can you please do this for us? But say to the leaders in Europe and the United States and Washington, what can we do for you? Because if you ask someone to help you, you will get the minimum. If you offer to help them, then in fact, then we understand that there is a bargain to be made. And the first part of self-sufficiency is that you be involved in crafting your own bargain. So again, coming back to Joe Biden, I think he understood this. One of the major roles that he played was, how do we get the new democracies, that is the new Europe, from Latvia and Lithuania, to Romania and Bulgaria, into not just NATO, but the EU. And he understood that the Europe of the Western Europe, the old Europe of which you have spoken of, sometimes just doesn't see beyond its nose or beyond its own immediate issues. And he said, let me put all these countries into NATO. And by pulling them into NATO and the Western Alliance, we will help, number one, establish a level of stability, which in itself is not just institutional stability, but also helps bring in investments. And this will, in fact, also serve both as a catalyst, but also as another political way to push Europe into admitting these countries into the EU. Now, if we look at Poland and Hungary, you might say, why would they want to go through that again? And the answer is, first of all, when we talk about Poland and Hungary, that's something that is probably better dealt with from within Europe than outside. But at the same time, if Europe comes to the conclusion that countries like Hungary or Poland are no longer fulfilling minimum standards of a European democracy, they should be able to kick them out. We in Bosnia are very much willing. So here's the final question. Well, how the heck are we going to do this with a large part of the country, specifically based in Banja Luka, potentially other areas, may not want to be a part of this? Well, how did Cyprus do it? No one said, hey, what about those Turkish Cypriots? How are we going to deal with them if they don't want to be part of the EU or NATO or whatever? That question was never raised. So I'm not exactly sure why this issue, why a veto is given to people who have committed ethnic cleansing and who have established a status quo, but who also now are acting as agents for those powers that seek to undermine the Euro-Atlantic family. And when I was foreign minister, and this is very memorable because it happened on the night that Srebrenica fell, I found myself in Strasbourg. Why? Because there was a meeting of the European parliamentarians, very influential people at that time, probably close to 100 of them, who understood that the way to resolve Bosnia was to offer admission to Bosnia to the European Union, not on the basis of Bosnia fulfilling some conditions, but say, no, we're first going to admit you, and then we're going to help you fulfill the conditions. Why is the admission first important? Some extraordinary mechanism, because you have to create the boundaries, the framework within which everything else would be built. Dayton Agreement, I can tell you guys, it's an improvisation. It's like going to art class in kindergarten and the teacher giving you a bunch of crayons to color in. It was designed, on the one hand, to get an agreement as quickly as possible, as I mentioned, for the political agenda of people like Holbrooke and others. On the other hand, someone like Milosevic and potentially Tudjman wanted to design a country that was weak, even subject to be exploited or broken up. And then here we are, those representing the Bosnian core, who are dealt with, how do we salvage this? On the one hand, you're telling us build a country that functions, and on the other hand, people like Holbrooke and Bildt are pulling us into the trap of drawing maps. Now you kind of understand that if you're drawing maps with new lines, that means that someone is saying maybe this will be divided in the future. So how do you reconcile that with saying the country as a whole needs to be part of the Euro-Atlantic family? Well, a bad thing and a good thing has happened since then. And this comes back to your question. The bad thing is that in fact, those lines have been made much more like a wound or a cut. But at the same time, the good thing is we understand that much of this, what's being cut, much of what's being dealt with in terms of Bosnia is designed not in Banja Luka or even Belgrade. It's designed in a place like Kremlin with a much broader agenda. Again, we found ourselves 100 years before in this place where we are, the pawns in someone else's game. And the answer that I'm just suggesting is maybe we'll still remain the pawns, but maybe we can upgrade our status, or at least if we are the pawns, we will not allow ourselves to be played like pawns, but we will in fact become something much more direct, not in dealing with our own internal situation. You know, Izetbegovic goes to meet Dodik. That's a fool's errand, because Dodik is not even playing Dodik's game anymore. When a Bosnian goes to meet a US official, European official is going to say, now we've got a problem, not us in Bosnia, but you and I have a problem. And that's the message that needs to be made clear.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Bajrović, you campaigned for President-elect Biden. You know some of his closest advisors and colleagues very well, including Antony Blinken, future Secretary of State. Given Biden's political advocacy for Bosnia in the 1990s, do you foresee a more active policy role for the US in Bosnia and in the Balkans in general? And do you agree with some analysts who say that despite the internal and external problems that the United States is facing, the Biden administration is going to work on reforms in Bosnia, and some of them even say potentially even Dayton Agreement revision?
The mother of all questions. My view is that Biden will engage. I think that he's got a very direct feeling of responsibility for Bosnia. I think he was on the right side of history. I mean, Ambassador Sacirbey, which knows much better, but as somebody who watched CNN 24/7 at the time, there was something called the CNN headline news. So we would watch everything, you know, that was going on hour by hour, and C-SPAN gave a lot of the just sort of, you know, background information via the hearings and so on. It seemed like Biden was completely aware of the shortcomings of Dayton and what the Clinton people did. I tend to be a bit more of a realist. I mean, I've spent so much time in the arena that I maybe sometimes don't see the light, the sun shining as brightly as it might be shining. I think they'll engage. I'm somewhat optimistic, not only because of Biden. I think Biden is a game changer, not only for Bosnia, but I think for the entire world. But I'm optimistic because I think that the Bosnian side has come to a point of maturity politically. I think people are, by and large, aware that there are ways to improve the situation of the democratic majority in Bosnia with the tacit consent of the international community. Now, the problem that we had was that everything that Muhammad said applies. I mean, I feel European. We are, you know, undoubtedly, when you live in the US, you're perceived as a white person, as a person of European descent. And there's so many cultural and other connections with Europe and the West. And you know, we've been geographically close for a very long time, but I think historically, we're the other Europe. I mean, we were part of the same world as the West nominally for, you know, less than 40 years. Yugoslav times were in between. During the Ottoman times, we're in between. During the Bosnian Kingdom, we're really in between. We're our own world in many ways. So I guess I disagree. I think over the years, I've come to actually, I've evolved in my position. I tend to be more of a realist. I think Izetbegovic actually had it right. I mean, I think he was right. I mean, I used to think that it was very different. I thought that we had more agency. I thought that we were the ones who decide how we're viewed. But I guess identity is oftentimes in the eye of the beholder. So, you know, the way that people see us is not something we can control. Having said that, I think Biden is going to help the region in general a lot. But I think he's going to help Bosnia in the sense that if the rules of the game are reinstated, so if OHR is strengthened, if EU4 is strengthened, I think we'll have a window of opportunity to actually do something next 4 years. The elephant in the room is the demographic changes. Nobody talks about demographic changes. How are demographic changes going to impact the electoral outcomes? It seems like if we were to project the present demographic trends to 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that the Bosnian cause, so the people who really, the parties that despite all their downsides, still support Bosnian statehood, Bosnian sovereignty, will probably be in a better position than they are right now. So I think it's a two-step game, and it's something that can be done with the assistance of the Americans in the next 25, to 30, 35 years. I always take the long view. So because we're actually talking about 25 years of Dayton, I still feel like I think I'm still this more or less the same person I was in 1995. So it's a long time, but it's not that long, right? In terms of history. So I think that the first step has to be the reform of the federation. I think the federation, the ethnic veto mechanism must be done away with initially at the federation level, and that can be done with over the objections of HDZ in the next few years. I think that's the first step. I think the RS is a tougher nut to crack, because I think it depends on reversal of the trend of people who are originally from the RS not participating in the elections. I think key thing is going to be to get them to participate. And that might create conditions for some sort of a better deal overall, because again, unfortunately, Muhammad, I hope that you're right, but my experience is somewhat different. I think that the European Union does not really want us in the EU. I mean, I've taken part in these negotiations, and there's a very clear understanding that the Bosnian accession is not on the table. It's been like that for many years. I mean, I could go on now for hours, I guess, talking about why I think so, based on my own experience and just things that for example, EU's refusal to sanction Dodik. I mean, there's no explanation for that. And I used to spend a lot of my time trying to convince the Europeans to do that. It was always a no, as Macron would say. So I think we need some sort of a global change that would change the way that Europe sees itself, maybe induced via Washington. But unless there's a new government in France and some sort of change of heart in Netherlands and a different approach to the Balkans in Berlin, EU accession is not on the table. That's just not realistic. We shouldn't talk about it. We shouldn't think about it. The NATO accession is a different story, but I think that the reform of the Bosnian state and the Dayton Accords, which, as Muhammad said, I agree, it has actually gave us a crutch and then put us in the wheelchair. I think that has to be done outside of the framework of EU. Because I'll just give you two examples. EU actually has used the European integration process to further weaken the Bosnian state. So one of the worst things that the EU has done in Bosnia in the last 25 years is the introduction of the so-called coordination mechanism. Now, it's something that doesn't sound like much, but they've actually managed to give the entities and even the cantons veto power over something that I read all the books about Dayton, Muhammad, so I know you insisted on this. That even Dayton gave Bosnian state exclusive rights in terms of foreign policy. Now, what they did was they basically gave the cantons and the entities veto power over Bosnia's foreign policy when it comes to EU accession, which is frankly ridiculous. But it was a request directly, came from Brussels. How it came about is a story for another day. But the other important element is, for example, EU's insistence in 2014 on the amendment of the law on residency, Zakon o prebivalištu. That was just an incredible move by the EU, which essentially gave the RS police the ability to selectively apply Annex 7. So RS police can theoretically now, and does very often actually, refuse the right to register. You come back, for example, let's say from St. Louis, you want to go live in Srebrenica. RS police has the right to actually deny you the request to actually settle in Srebrenica, right? That was done with direct involvement of Berlin, and highest ranking German person in the EU delegation, Sarajevo, actually lobbied for this. It took them 2 years, but they pushed it through. And I can go on and on. For example, when they essentially in 2011, after Dodik threatened them with secession, Ashton and Lajčák flew here, and I was actually in those meetings. And their bottom line was, you know what? We're going to give Dodik the judiciary so he doesn't feel threatened, So he doesn't, he doesn't go ahead with the referendum. And they actually wanted OHR to sit still. I mean, that was their request. So I'm just not as optimistic.
Ralph, can I just interrupt you? I understand where you're coming from. I've learned, being a little bit older than you, that there is a set of dynamics that go beyond where we are. I think the analysis that you performed is like a general practitioner, an MD, taking a look at the patient and saying, these are all the things that are wrong. And the answer is, if you, for example, you compared Bosnians to Jews, I think that's a fair comparison. In the 1930s and 40s, the Jews here were basically, in the United States, were rather unwelcome, including those refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. Jews were viewed not just with great suspicion, but as something of second or third rate citizens. When Israel was established, Truman was one of the first to recognize it, but it wasn't particularly done with any great affection. Now, Jews are very much considered a part of Western society. No one speaks of them as being part of either East or West. And number two, and this is the most important point, when we speak of Israel, doesn't matter what the reality is. What matters is the perception, which is what you're getting at. Israel is viewed as an ally of the United States and somehow important to America's strategic interest in the Middle East. Whether that is the actual case or not really doesn't matter. But that's what binds Washington and Tel Aviv, now let's say Jerusalem. And from that perspective, we have to understand that there's a set of dynamics that evolve. What you have spoken of over the last 25 years is a set of the wrong dynamics. And what I spoke of in the beginning is also a set of dynamics. In other words, we shouldn't have gone to Dayton immediately, or at least we certainly shouldn't have signed the agreement that it was until another set of dynamics were fulfilled. Now, I can tell you all about the wrong things we could have done differently, but now we are where we are, as they say. So the question is, does Bosnia really have a role to play in the Euro-Atlantic strategic perspective? And if you look at it objectively, it does. If you look at it from the perspective of how the Bosnian leaders are acting, they're always asking for something. They're rarely offering. And what I mean by that is when Israel comes to the United States and needs something, the first thing they do is they offer something. They always project something that they can do for the United States. So we are not 6 million Jews in the United States. But the Bosnian population here is very important. And the fact that we don't look and necessarily our names don't sound like the names of a typical Christian white America, that's actually also our advantage. Something has happened to America as well that's not so good over the last 20, 30 years. Being older than you, when I came to this country in 1967, even before I became a US citizen, in a school of 3,000 overwhelmingly white and Christian kids, I was elected to my student council. I'm not sure that would happen again in that type of school. What I'm suggesting to you is there is a set of dynamics and we are part of that dynamics. Now, my role as yours is limited as an individual. But I think we also have to look at the role of others and others capable of producing their own set of visions, dynamics, agendas. I will now mention one thing that everyone seems to remember, and I certainly do fondly, which is the U2 concert in Sarajevo, 1997. That was not so much a celebration of peace as it was a vision of what Bosnia and Herzegovina could be. That on the same stage, you could have domestic rock bands, a foreign world-known rock band, and then an Islamic choir. That is Bosnia's stage. And that stage is very unique and very needed. Now that stage is needed in Berlin. It's needed in London. It's needed in parts of the United States. Certainly it's needed in a place like Kabul, although we can discuss whether something like that will ever happen in Kabul or Baghdad. But basically, Bosnia has one strength, It is a survivor, and it is a marketplace of ideas. And we survive because we consume usually the best of those ideas, even though everyone from around us seems to want to sell us their own particular concept of the idea. The difference now is that we're not even allowed to consume. We are just being told what to eat, what to drink, and the first thing is you have to establish yourself as having a vision of where you belong. Now, we're not like slaves where we say, we belong, we want to be free. No, we actually belong with the masters. We belong with the masters because we at least want to be the masters of our own destiny. And being the master of your own destiny also means now, like the people of Hong Kong have learned, or like the people of, let's use the word East Turkmenistan have learned, that means being able to deal with the global tidal winds that you're caught in. Because the people of Hong Kong, God bless them, they wanted freedom, they wanted democracy, but they got eaten up by a much larger geopolitical consideration. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is, let's not speak of ourselves as a Hong Kong where we're going to be subject, just have these forces coming on top of us. Let's be like a Berlin, because you remember what Kennedy said when he went to Berlin, I am a Berliner. And and people used to say, when I was in my position as UN ambassador and foreign minister, they used to say I'm a Bosnian because they understood what we stood for. When we, in fact, only became Bosnians, only concerned about how to deal with Dodik or Čović, then we lost it. So I don't have a direct roadmap for you. People like you, but specifically you are really more than capable of developing that roadmap in your head, putting it down on paper if necessary, because you've been there. It's just that they've been trying to, for so long, impress upon you how you can't drive the car on that roadmap. And the answer is the dynamics change. The dynamics change. And you must be prepared to not only for the change to occur, but to influence the direction of those dynamics.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ultimately, it's going to be whether we seize the chance that's ahead or not. Because I think the next 4 years are a historic opportunity for Bosnia. And I think that Ismail has pointed out that the Biden campaign knows Bosnia extremely well. The Bosnian Americans, as you said, actually a very good point that I raised myself a few times as well. The Bosnian American community in Georgia is going to play a huge role in the future of the U.S. Really. I mean, if the Democrats get the Senate, I mean, history will look very different than and if they don't. So there's a favorable political dynamic all around, I think, within American context. But I don't think we should fool ourselves. I think Europe that you dealt with is a different Europe than the one we see today. I think the Brits have a different view than the French or the continental Europeans in general. I think it's a different Europe.
I dealt with Mitterrand.
Hey, look, Mo, we read.
Do you remember? Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read the story. When I went to see Mitterrand with Harris Silajdžić, and our ambassador to Paris, and I pointed to Mitterrand that our ambassador to Paris, Dr. Nikola Kovač, a wonderful man, an academic, was a Serb himself when Mitterrand started referring to us just as Muslims, not even the Sarajevo government. When I referred to Mitterrand that Dr. Nikola Kovač was a Serb, Mitterrand turned to him and asked him if it was true. And when Nikola Kovač very cognitively explained to him why he was on the Bosnian side, Mitterrand called him a traitor. On the basis of this, someone else, Bernard Henry Levy, cut his relations with Mitterrand. He and Mitterrand were very close because he understood that a bigot like Mitterrand, who had his own Vichy France history, an association with the Nazis, basically once a bigot, always a bigot, and he can turn it against anyone. So what I'm suggesting to you is things can change very much for the better. Jacques Chirac was a much more positive factor.
That was great.
And I have no doubt that Macron, even Macron, can be turned to the positive. But Macron sometimes gets caught in his own rhetoric, like many of us do, including me, of course. And he needs to be shown why the Bosnia problem is not a Muslim problem. It is a European problem from which many of the people that he needs to address in his own country, not just Muslims, but extremists on the right, so-called Christian right, they will exploit Bosnia for their own use, just like a killer did in Norway. That's what we need to convey to them in the future. And if we just speak of how Bosnia is being dealt with in some internal game, then I think we are in for a much longer period of despair, as you suggest. If, on the other hand, they see in Bosnia an interest, like America, right or wrong, saw an interest in Israel, all of a sudden you go from being someone that's protected and cared for and a lot of money and maybe weapons are sent to someone who's viewed as a critical ally. And that's where your original comparison to Bosnians as Jews is important, because I firmly believe we do belong in the West, but that doesn't mean we're not a bridge to many other communities. And I don't mean Muslims necessarily as a whole. We are a unique population. We are a population of Muslims that has valued our diversity. We are not a Muslim population that has sought to be homogeneous. We, in fact, have always sought to respect heterogeneity. And that was our history even before we became largely Muslims, because obviously many of us didn't become Muslims. That's why we have what used to be called 100 and some years ago, Bosnian Orthodox and Bosnian Catholic. That's what they were called before. Now they call themselves Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats because that is the pool of nationalism.
Thank you, gentlemen. We are slightly over time, a few minutes, but I would like to conclude with one of the questions from the audience. The question is for you, Ambassador Sacirbey, from Melissa. She asks, Ambassador, are you suggesting Bosnia should take a position of Israel in terms of getting an ally in the US? And what, in your opinion, what can Bosnia offer to the allies?
Well, most importantly, I'm not suggesting any particular political move, but let me not avoid that question. As foreign minister, I did establish, as part of the directive from the presidency, relations with Cyprus, controlled by a Greek majority. Why? Because Cyprus is a part of Europe, and that was as important to us as our relationships with Turkey. So that's part of realpolitik. I also wanted to establish relationships with Israel, but in that case, President Bajrović blocked that, not because I have any particular feeling about Israel. I have no qualms about saying I'm sympathetic to the Palestinian plight, and but nonetheless, it was important for Bosnia and Herzegovina, in my view at that time, particularly the Muslim foreign minister, to establish the relationships with Israel, because guess what happened? A week after I left my post as foreign minister, Dr. Jadranko Prlić, a Croat, established those relationships. So sometimes you know that there is a way that history flows and you need to take the initiative. That would not be, in my view, a pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian or move. That would be a recognition of what the reality is. And on the basis of that reality, I thought that Bosnia actually could play a very constructive role in helping bring Israeli-Palestinian peace. We have seen where that's gone for another 3 decades without any conclusion. By the way, we did play a very constructive role in helping bring about Northern Irish peace. In 1998, we invited all the so-called warring factions, if you would, from Northern Ireland. And with help of the United States, the EU, we actually had a conference in Sarajevo that brought together those parties from Northern Ireland. Why? Because we recognized 2 things. that a lot of time these discussions about history and religious and other differences are overblown. So they are in fact used as an excuse or rationalization for the most extreme views to prevail and for the interest of the ordinary citizens to be forgotten. And if you look now at Joe Biden, he's made it very clear to the British that since the EU was an important framework for establishing peace in Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson and Brexit, be very careful what you do not to dismantle that. So that brings me to the final point of your question, which is it's all about the framework within which you work. And that's why I'm suggesting to you that the framework has to be with Bosnia being accepted either de facto, if not de jure, as a member of the European family. De jure means we also are sitting at the table as equals. De facto means people say, you have to come into this family because we need you to be there. And why do they need us to be there? Well, the first reason is very simple. They don't want us to be a constant point of instability. It's clear the left in this situation, Bosnia is a vacuum. And we've seen that vacuums generally are filled by the most extreme, most provocative forces. So if for no other reason, Bosnia needs to be a part of that family to prevent a future situation that gets worse for Europe and the United States. But can it help? And I've already mentioned why it can help. I've already involved in several of these causes. European Muslims in particular, but Europeans as a whole, need to have a vision of what diversity looks like and where they fit. We've for too long used the word tolerance. And tolerance means I'm okay with you doing what you want, but you know what, I don't see any value in it. And as soon as you kind of offend me, I'm going to become intolerant. Diversity means that someone who's really kind of kooky and I may never want to have a cup of coffee with, certainly never want to share anything with more than an exchange of dollar bills. Now, all of a sudden, that kooky person establishes the most innovative new technology company or has an element of art or economics that brings benefit and prosperity to the whole of society. That's what, if you look at what the United States has done over the last 20 or 30 years, it has been the advance of the kooks, those people who do not fit in. And because they don't fit in, frequently they are not just necessarily people who may fall to the side of society, but many of them can rise to visions that help the society as a whole.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll conclude with this point. I would also like to thank our audience for engaging with us, for posing questions. We are very much looking forward to our future events with both you, Mr. Ambassador, and Mr. Bajrovic, but also all other allies and friends of Bosnia and Bosnian Advocacy Center. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon in the US and have a good evening in Bosnia.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.